Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic extravaganza. It is Tuesday at 10:52. Pretty normal, well, relatively reasonable winter day. It's been kind of a brutal winter, in all honesty. Yesterday, the day before, we had a massive snowstorm. Spent a long time digging out. I had to dig out my girlfriend's place, and then dug out my place, and it was and it's been cold and cold as hell. So, but today seems like and it was super. It's been super windy. I was worried last night that the power was going to get knocked out, but luckily it didn't. Now it seems like it's just kind of normal and a little bit warmer and not as windy. So, but it's a nice sunny day. So anyway, so I hope everyone's doing good. Today's show is going to be on a movie by my favorite horror exploitation director of all time, and that is the Maestro Lucio Fulci. And the movie that I'm going to be talking about is a later film of his called Aenigma. I have, I mean, it's when I talk about Lucio Fulci, I did a show on Lucio Fulci last year for this channel, and I kind of, took a deep dive, and I'll probably do at some point I'll do another video on Lucio Fulci because there's a lot to unpack, there's a lot to talk about. Just he was so incredibly prolific. He's most well known, at least for me. I discovered him through his horror films. When I was a kid, I saw quite a few of his films. Back in the 80s, I was, again, a child of the VHS era. The dark period of the video nasties when, movies were banned throughout Europe. But all those movies survived, and now those films and those directors, I feel, are getting their due thanks to all of these amazing boutique labels that have come out, particularly Severin. And but as a kid, I discovered Lucio Fulci. The first few movies that I remember seeing as a kid, the first one I remember seeing was House by the Cemetery, and then I saw the Gates of Hell trilogy, The Beyond, House by the Cemetery, and The Gates of Hell. I saw those movies as a kid, whether it was like back when I was a kid, there were cable late night horror movie marathons. Even before, a little bit after that period, Joe Bob Briggs, who is, one of the most iconic purveyors of, and one of the most intelligent, one of the funniest guys, but he is a walking encyclopedia when it comes to all things horror, especially in the B movie exploitation world. He had a series of shows, and I think he still has a new show on Shudder now. But towards the 90s, he had a show that was amazing, and he covered all of these movies. But before that, there were a series of, Elvira, the iconic, horror, movie personality. She had a show. There was a series of other, like, kind of late night horror shows where they would basically from like 10 o'clock till about 1 or 2 in the morning, they would show a whole bunch of these really low budget horror exploitation movies. Back when cable was a thing, and that was how I got exposed to these amazing films. Like a million other kids, probably the first kind of low budget slasher movie I ever saw was the Friday, the original Friday 13th. And then after that, I saw Halloween, John Carpenter's classic, and that's when the floodgates kind of opened for me. And then those were the two movies I remember seeing first in kind of the slasher genre, and then that led to me watching all of these other movies and being exposed to them. And I remember seeing the House by the Cemetery, which is, I mean, I'm Lucio Fulci is my favorite horror director, or my favorite Italian horror director, but probably my favorite director in the entire genre. And I remember seeing House by the Cemetery on VHS when I was like, I don't know, 11 or 12 years old. And I was just like, wow, like this stuff was so much more. I remember, and I still believe this now, but the American slasher movies were, of course, fantastic and just they're classic. But there was something about the Italian movies that were just, they just were a little bit more dirtier. They were, sleazier, but the practical effects were just so gruesome. They just seemed like at kind of a next level. And I remember when I first saw House by the Cemetery, to me it was such a different experience, and much more of a primal experience, and almost more of a scarier experience. I remember that movie gave me nightmares as a kid. But then I got obsessed with that, and that was definitely, I remember discovering Lucio Fulci films before I got into Dario Argento. I didn't see Suspiria for a while, and I saw that eventually, and then I got exposed to his films, and then seeing Mario Bava films. But the other thing too was when I was a kid, I really didn't, I wasn't really in the mindset of like who the directors were, or like, the genres, or the subgenres in the horror world. Like I never knew what the word was. I never knew what the word exploitation was at that age, or what, say a nun exploitation movie was, or a crime exploitation movie was. And I definitely didn't know what the giallo genre was. Like I saw all of those films, but I just kind of looked at them. I was 11 or 10 or 11 years old, and I just looked at them as being just really grimy, scary, gory, gore-soaked films. But obviously, as I got older, especially now where I've gotten so many of these movies that I grew up on, I kind of connected the dots, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's Lucio Fulci, and this is all of his work, and then Dario Argento, and I did that. Been doing that with all of the directors and of the films that I really connected to as a kid. And again, with Lucio Fulci being one of the most prolific directors, I mean, he's mostly known as, I mean, he probably garnered the most attention in his career with the horror films that he directed. But that being said, he directed so. I mean, when I think of the scope of the amount of movies that he directed in his career, I think it's almost safe to say that the horror genre was just kind of a smaller fraction of the films that he actually did, which is when I kind of came to that realization, I was kind of like, wow, like that's crazy. And when over the years I've taken a much deeper dive into his work, I realized, wow, he did, I mean, all kinds of genres of films, westerns, war movies, giallo films, even comedies, sci-fi movies. And so he's done all kinds of exploitation movies. I mean, if you can pick a style or a genre within the genre, he's done it. And so at this point, I have most of his horror films on Blu-ray. There's still a few I need to get, But when it comes to his horror period, I have most of them now on Blu-ray, and I've covered a lot of his films on this channel. But that being said, realizing how prolific he was as a director, and how he, the horror is just kind of a smaller portion of his career. There's so many movies of his I have not seen. But even that being said, I've arrived to that conclusion that he's my favorite, horror director. So, I have been slowly discovering all kinds of other films by him. More so recently, with his Giallo films. And I have covered some of those other films too. I do own them, but I'm at this point I am still mostly steeped in the world of his horror films. Um, and one of the criticisms that happens a lot with Lucio Fulci is, I mean, he worked so incredibly hard as a director, but he was so prolific. But even he got very sick later on in his career, in the late '80s into the '90s, and he was not doing very well. But he still like worked his ass off constantly, and I see it, you know, a lot online, or people who talk a lot about Lucio Fulci's career, where they kind of criticize his later films, like movies that came out in the late '80s and beyond, like in the toward the '90s. He directed quite a few films, and there's this kind of opinion, more or less, of that he kind of lost his way, and because he was sick, and he his budgets for his films were smaller and smaller, and he never really got embraced by the bigger world, like other Italian directors, like say Fellini and what have you. His career as he went on kind of diminished, and the height of his power was, you know, well, with like the Beyond trilogy and House by the Cemetery, like that was the apex of his career. And today's show is going to be on this movie here, Enigma. This is one of his later films, and again, there are a lot of films. I have seen a ton of his films. I own a lot of his films now, but because Lucio Fulci was so prolific, I am literally discovering a new movie by him every day. It's wild, and so there's a shit ton of movies that I have not seen, particularly his non-horror films. But this is kind of considered. This is a later film, Enigma. This came out in 1987, and this is a movie I bought probably about a month ago, and I finally sat down last night and I watched it. And I don't know, and this movie is killer. It's amazing, and I don't know why I waited so long to watch this. I'm like, what's wrong with me? But anyway, I've seen like again, I've seen a lot of criticism of Fulci, of where people said that after those aforementioned movies, his career kind of went to a degree downhill because of his physical and his health issues, and all of these things, and that his that the budgets for his films, I mean, all of his films are really low budget, but the production level on a lot of his later films did kind of go down significantly. But this was one of those movies that, again, this was a movie that I've seen criticized. But I have to say, I mean, on one hand, my favorite films of his are definitely that period of the Gates of Hell trilogy, and you know those films I think are you know my personal favorites of his. Like those are just, when it comes to horror films, I really feel like those movies are so important and just so fucking entertaining that it's kind of blasphemy to say that you're a horror fan and you're not a fan of Fulci,
Already off.
or that you've never seen those movies, or that you discard Italian horror cinema. I think those movies are just so important and they're so fucking influential and they're just amazing. They're so fun and they're just crazy. I feel like those films are kind of like the holy grails of Italian cinema and the horror exploitation world. But that being said, that that period, the late '70s, early '80s, the New York Ripper's another one. I just that's another film of his that's just a pure masterpiece. Probably this, I don't know, probably the outside of Bill Luswig's the Maniac. It's a close tie, but I think the New York Ripper might be the most brutal and the most sleaziest movie ever made. I mean that movie is just like it's so nasty. I feel like when you watch the New York Ripper, you have to like take a shower after you watch it. It's just so fucking amazing. But and again, that is part of that time period of when he did the Gates of Hell trilogy. But I do love. I mean, and again, I have his later. I have some of his Warriors of 2049, which is one of his much later films from the late '80s, which is a kind of post-apocalyptic sci-fi movie. I've seen that movie kind of trashed a lot and criticized, but I fucking love that movie. And I have to say, all of the movies. Another movie of his that I've heard criticized a lot is Demonia, which a lot of people say that it's got, same thing with Enigma. Like, it's got a lot of good ideas and it's got some great kills, but the story and everything kind of falls flat and it's just not as cohesive as those other films. But I have to say, I love that film as well. Yeah, I think those other aforementioned films are my favorites, and those are the best. But I think his later films are fantastic, and I think Enigma is just awesome. Like if you've never seen this movie, and again, it's one of his later films, but it's super awesome. It's very I don't know. It's kind of like a got a little bit of a gothic vibe, but it's like classic kind of macabre horror, and it's got some amazing kills, and the story is kind of bonkers, kind of crazy, but I think it makes sense. That's one of the criticisms of Lucio Fulci's later films is that the storylines are just not really complete, and there's not really any cohesiveness. But Enigma, I think, is just awesome. I watched it for the first time for me last night. It was my first time ever seeing this movie. I'm at a point now when I see anything with Lucio Fulci's title, especially if it's a movie he's directed, I will scoop it up because, he's my favorite. He's the man. The story is pretty wild. The spirit of a comatose teen girl possesses the body of a newcomer to her girls' boarding school, and then it returns to enact bloody revenge against the elitist coeds responsible for her condition. The other thing that's interesting about this movie Enigma, it definitely has I can see it definitely has a big influence from Dario Argento's Suspiria. It has that kind of vibe because it takes place at a school, which is kind of the with Suspiria it takes place at a dance school. So it has that kind of vibe and flavor, and it kind of has those similar traits with the characters. But again, it's its own thing. I think, there's that saying, good composers borrow, great composers steal. So and these guys, all of these Italian directors, you know, they were in the art of exploitation and trying to capitalize on a market, but yet having an incredible amount of imagination. And I think that this is an example. Like he definitely stole a lot of ideas. I think from Suspiria, because Suspiria was a mega hit and one of the most you know. I mean, I think it's safe to say that Suspiria is probably in the world of Italian horror exploitation movies, Suspiria is probably the most popular, and it's a fucking masterpiece. But it's one of the most influential, and I think one of the most well known, easily. You will have people, and I've seen it happen online, where people will talk about all things horror, and they don't really spend much time talking about European horror films or whatnot, or Italian horror films, but they always mention Dario Argento's Suspiria, because that movie became such culturally became such an iconic film that everyone and their grandmother pretty much knows Suspiria. So, but Enigma definitely has a big influence from that movie, but I think in a good way, because it does have Lucio Fulci does have his own way about him as a director. It's totally its own thing. It's totally bonkers crazy. There are some pretty nasty kills in this movie. It has a kind of a surrealist quality. It has like a kind of a classic. My first impression of the film, it has like this classic, kind of macabre horror vibe to it, almost like, like a classic Vincent Price, Roger Corman, gothic horror kind of vibe to it. But yet it's very sleazy and very low budget, and it's got some incredibly gruesome violence in it. But it's awesome, and it's got elements of a possession movie. There's a lot of dream sequences in the movie. It's awesome, and again, I never seen this movie before. There's a really great documentary on the making of this movie, or it's more of a retrospective, but it's really great. And this is another fabulous release by Severin. Severin is just amazing. Like, I can't believe the shit they put out, and the transfer of this on Blu-ray is just amazing. And again, like I said before, even though this is a later period Fulci movie, and he was not doing physically very well, and he was taking some hits. This movie still kicks ass and worth your time. So I highly recommend it. Again, like, I'm at a point now where anytime I'm at Bull Moose, if I see a movie with that's directed by Lucio Fulci, whatever the fuck it is, and I don't own it, I will snag it up. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.